Hey guys. So my girls are supposed to be outside playing, but they are on a great hunt for one of their favorite toys. So if they interrupt, I'm sorry. Um, Chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in a burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Remember, that's the broken jars from the sploosh. Stanley carried the sack. Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said. I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign and headed out. It was the hottest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to when the water truck wished he had at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero and the other had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The splush had saved Zero's life, but now it was destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he too felt its effects. He looked at the big thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they had first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley said. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using his shovel, pulled himself up to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at the big thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked and then wait 10 minutes before looking up again to see if it seemed any closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realized they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou. Stanley smiled. I guess she was a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. Bet she was pretty, Zero said. Someone must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. Bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting on the boat with her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as his third leg. The 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I gotta stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at the big thumb. Still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade, then fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a low moaning coming from inside of him. He looked up at the shovel and couldn't help but to think he might have to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up. Once again, flashing a thumbs up. Give me some words, he said weakly. And Stanley, in a few seconds, realized what he meant. He smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out himself. Run. Run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on, and besides the pain and the weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked at the big thumb, it did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to walk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted. Yet, as bad as he felt, he knew Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going. It was possible, he thought, he hoped, and he didn't even get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria was only on the jars which opened easy, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. And what scared Stanley most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe it was the moment of his death he would be too weak to feel pain. Death would be a relief. But what worried him the most was the thought that his parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He'd been imagining what it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone for Zero, but nobody cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she would tell them and when. What do you think is up there? Zero said. Stanley looked up at the big thumb. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, Stanley said. I want an ice cream sundae, said Zero, with nuts and whipped cream and a banana and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the end of the lake. A huge white stone cliff rose up before them. Unlike the east shore, where the Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope gently down. It was as if they were walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they somehow had to climb out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliff rocks blocked their view. The cliff rocks also blocked the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide, 6 inches deep, running down the cliff. On either side of the ruts were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It took about a 50-foot climb straight up. Stanley managed to hold his sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from the ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had used the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Stanley stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others stuck out no more than a few inches. Just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. Are you okay? Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge, 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't have any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero, and then I'll pull you up with a shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, Zero said. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley said. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together, and Zero stepped on the interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding stab of rock, and Stanley continued to help him up from below as Zero pulled himself onto the ledge. While Zero was getting himself situated there, Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He held it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed a hold of the sack, then the shovel. He set down the shovel so it was half of the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung down to Stanley. Okay, he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was the one thing for him to lift Zero half of his weight. This was quite another thing for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed a hold of the shovel and he climbed up the rock wall using the ledges of the rut to help support him. His hands moved along one another of the shaft of the shovel. He felt Zero's hand grasp his wrist. He let go of the shaft with one hand and grabbed on top of the ledge. He gathered all of his strength for a brief second that seemed to defy gravity as he took a step on the wall and, with Zero's help, pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There was no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He had held onto the metal blade of the shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Stanley brought his hands to his mouth and sucked up his blood. On one of the glass jars that had broken, they decided to save the pieces. That might make for a knife or something. They rested briefly and climbed up. It was fairly easy to climb the rest of the way. When they first reached the ground, Stanley looked at the sun, a fiery ball balancing on top of Green Thumb. God was twirling his basketball. Soon they were working along the shadow of the thumb.